We had a great discussion in the first panel about the early 20th century entrepreneurs, and we're going to continue our trip down memory lane into the Depression and New Deal era with the second panel. And to introduce it, I'd like to invite one of our Coolidge senators, Shub Gupta, to come forward. Shub?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Shub Gupta. I'm a Coolidge senator from the class of 2021 and a student at Yale College. The title of this session is The New Deal, World War II, and Business. Our moderator is Miss Amity Schlaze. Miss Schlaze chairs the board of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation and is the author of Coolidge, a best-selling biography of the 30th president. She's the author of 4 other New York Times bestsellers. Most relevant to this panel is her book, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression. Miss Schlaze is the recipient of the Bradley Prize and the William F. Buckley Prize. She serves as a fellow of the National Review Institute. I see they're already up here, but please welcome Amity Schlaze and our esteemed panelists to the stage.
Welcome. We come now to a period both rough and dynamic, the 1930s and World War II. It's my job to sketch the facts. America confronted one of the most severe downturns in our history. You know that in 1932, unemployment hit 25%, 1 in 4 unemployed. A new president comes. He weighs the choice. Leave the economy to find its own footing. That's hard to do when 90%, after a 90% drop in the stock market and that number of unemployed, or lead the government and jump in and manage, indeed, in an unparalleled way. Other administrations before this new president, President Roosevelt, chose to pull back, most notably in the early 20s, the prior downturn, which was also a sharp one with high unemployment, but we call it the Forgotten Depression because it was so short. Here we are in the 30s. FDR makes a different choice. He's going to manage, he's going to push through a whole series of laws, what we call the New Deal, and take over the economy, agriculture, electricity, and industry through different pieces of legislation. The most famous, and one of the first, was called the National Industrial Recovery Act, but there was also a rather aggressive law regarding labor called the Wagner Act that created our modern labor system, the NLRB, all the things we know about. That came in 1935. And there were laws, succeeding laws for agriculture. Coming in for special attention and hostility was actually the most promising industry of the period. It was an industry about which people spoke with the same reverence they reserve for AI today, which was utilities. First, the administration blamed the utilities for the panic. Then it created a law known as the Death Sentence Act, or Death Act, to divide up the utilities. It also competed with the utilities, with the Rural Electrification Administration. Trouble was the economy did not respond to all this intervention truly. The economy didn't come back. I define recovery as meaning where we were before the downturn. That did not happen. The unemployment did not come back. Indeed, in the later 30s, unemployment was again over 15%, which is a level we're not accustomed to talking about or experiencing today. Where was business in all this? Business went along. It tried to adjust. As Congresswoman Fox said this morning, entrepreneurs are problem solvers. And Alexander Field, our first speaker, will speak about this period and, in fact, about how spectacularly businesses solve problems, including high labor costs. I commend to you his wonderful book, Great Leap, about the period. The 30s were, as Field notes, difficult, but also productive. business didn't necessarily feel it was time to get in politics, or it was its job. Business has to pick its battles, as I think Congresswoman Virginia also said. But one business leader picked the political battle. That was Wendell Willkie of the electric company Commonwealth and Southern, and we are so honored to have Wendell's from Indiana, his fellow Hoosier, Senator Todd Young, to talk about Willkie's choice to battle the government and his hopes for his company. And as you know, eventually Wendell ran for U.S. president in 1940. When the war ended, I'm missing one person, so hold me. When the war approached, suddenly Franklin Roosevelt, the president, needed business. To whom he needed guns, he needed tanks, and he turned to the same companies he had pestered or prosecuted or taxed before, and they rose to the challenge, as they say in the military. They sprang to and helped, and I'm so honored to have Arthur Herman, who's written a book about this, Freedom's Forge, to speak to you on that incredible support that business gave our forces and our country in a time of war. When the war ended, that's where I am now, a large question mark hung over the nation, which is, would the New Deal, the government intervention, continue? A new president, Harry Truman, probably wanted it to, and business had to decide where to go along and where to fight. In the 50s came the Korean conflict. As you know, when you have a war, that gives government even more authority to demand from business. You're seeing that this week. President Truman thought that the crisis could be handled better if we had more control, that is, Washington had more control of the steel industry, and he thought about nationalizing it. And this time, a business fought back. That was, as you'll hear from Garland Tucker, our speaker, a company called Youngstown Sheet and Tube. It did not want to be taken over, to be nationalized, and it went to this, all the way to the Supreme Court to fight this issue, to sustain its control of its assets. One of the heroes in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube story was an attorney named John Davis, and Garland is an expert in John Davis because he wrote a book about a year when John Davis ran for president, actually, against Calvin Coolidge in 1924. Just say one last thing. Why is this conference different from other conferences? Other conferences focus on policy and eventually, or very soon, get into the policy of today. We stick to history because we feel before you enter politics or policy discussions, you always do better when you know more about the past. So thank you, guests, for attending. And now I will turn to our first guest. That's
Hello? Okay,
Arthur,
great.
right?
Hi, I'm Alex Field. I want to start by extending a very great thanks to Amity for inviting me to this conference, which has been extraordinarily interesting for me. I want to spend a few moments today describing why I think I'm here. Okay, and the reason is for the past several decades I've been working on a project that has evolved into a basic rewriting of the macroeconomic history of the United States during the second quarter of the 20th century. I published multiple academic papers, beginning with my 2003 American Economic Review article entitled The Most Technologically Progressive Decade of the Century, and two books both published by Yale University Press. The first, which appeared in 2011, which Amity just referenced, and also I'm grateful for the blurb she placed in the recent Coolidge Review about that. It expanded on the argument of the AER article, and its central thesis is that behind the backdrop of double-digit unemployment during the Depression, for more than a decade, potential output grew by leaps and bounds, and so that by 1941, potential output of the economy was substantially larger than it had been in 1929. This growth of potential was not due primarily to increases in the key inputs of labor hours or physical capital services, but rather to improvements in productivity. Productivity should not be confused with production. Many of my students make that mistake. They are not the same. Productivity divides production or output by one or more measures of inputs. Labor productivity, that we hear a lot about because it governs basically the growth of our material standard of living, is output divided by labor hours or the number of people working. Total factor productivity you hear less about, except unless you're in an economics conference, is dividing output by a combined measure of labor and physical capital services. And as such, it's a rough measure of the level of scientific, technical, and organizational knowledge in a society. Labor productivity increases when the people in the economy, businesses, and households save, and physical capital services grow more rapidly than labor hours, meaning that the capital-labor ratio rises. Each worker cooperates with more physical capital. It also increases in an analytically separate way as the result of increases in TFP, the basic knowledge base of society. There wasn't much capital deepening between 1929 and 1941 in the private sector. The physical capital stock had plummeted between 1929 and 1933. It gradually kind of clawed back by the measures, but just conventional measures, it's about the same. So zero growth, basically. Hours also remarkably hardly grew at all between 29 and 41. There was a somewhat higher unemployment rate in 41. But by most measures, real output, real GDP was somewhere between 33 and 40% higher. That's essentially entirely due, according to my calculations, to the growth in total factor productivity. Now, faced with such an apparently counterintuitive conclusion, I'm basically saying that the roughly 3% growth in potential over that 12-year period is almost entirely driven by productivity growth. You might reasonably ask why. So I'll kind of just briefly run through the three major themes that I used to try to explain that. Now, the first of these was the build-out of the surface road infrastructure, including the U.S. route system, not the interstate system, which began under President Eisenhower in 1956, but the U.S. route system, as well as major bridge and tunnel construction. Such notable infrastructure investments as the Golden Gate Bridge in the Bay Area where I live, the Oakland Bay Bridge, the George Washington Bridge in New York, the Lincoln Tunnel in New York, for example, were all built in the 1930s, along with major hydro investments such as the Hoover and Grand Coulee dams. Actually, in reading up on Coolidge, you may be interested to know that the Boulder Canyon Project Act, which enabled federal funding for the Hoover Dam, was signed by President Calvin Coolidge in the last months of his presidency. Now, the second contributor, in my view, was the tail end, the last third of the boost to productivity and manufacturing that resulted from the shift in the internal distribution of power from the shafts and belts, the mechanical shafts and belts that were the signature of the 19th century power-driven factory, to electric power using small fractional horsepower electric motors. This transition allowed a complete redesign of the American factory, moving from 4 or 5 stories typically to 1 or 2 stories, and enormous productivity leaps in productivity within manufacturing, the bulk of which were experienced in the 1920s. But there was still about a third of that conversion left, so that's, I think, an important factor in the 30s as well. The third contributor was a remarkable and perhaps surprising increase during the 1930s in research and development spending and employment across the Depression years. During the Depression years, 1929 to 41, productivity advance took place across a very broad frontier of the American economy, unlike the 20s, where it was mostly limited to manufacturing and was fueling the stock market boom. In the 30s, it affected also wholesale and retail distribution, part of the spillovers from the surface road infrastructure improvement, as well as many advanced sectors within manufacturing, including aeronautics, electrical engineering, and chemical engineering. If you were a chemist or an engineer during the Depression, you basically, you kept your job, unlike workers, for example, in the construction sector. The second book, the more recent book, The Economic Consequences of U.S. Mobilization for the Second World War, came out in 2022. Building on the foundation of the prior work, it takes aim at what I see as the conventional wisdom about the supply side effects of U.S. mobilization for the war. The conventional wisdom is that learning by doing and producing military durables like Kaiser and the Liberty ships and Henry Ford and the B-24s at the Willow Run plant, that this learning helped lay the foundations for the golden age of U.S. economic growth. 1948 to 73. My argument is that from the standpoint of productivity advance, the war was a detour. And I see that Amity has actually included Table 2.1 in your little brochure, so you can see the plunging productivity within manufacturing, both between 29 and 33, and also between 1941 and 45. I show in the book that productivity in manufacturing, which is where we should expect to see the advance if the learning narratives are the central story, in fact plummeted. And in spite of recovery between 45 and 48, we still see these retardative effects if we try measuring from 41 to 48. The advantages of looking from 41 to 48 is that basically is a peacetime to peacetime comparison. So you're kind of finessing all the very difficult problems, measurement problems involving with data from the controlled economy of the 1940s. That said, in spite of those difficult issues, which I do my best to address, I take the position that the story told by the numbers is basically correct. The main reason is that the war forced a sudden, radical, and ultimately temporary change in the product mix, requiring manufacturers to shift from making goods in which they had a great deal of experience to making goods in which they had little. The war was a great success in production. We manufactured more than 300,000 aircraft, as Arthur will tell us about, I'm sure, between 1940 and 1945, and it's a feat we will never replicate. This was made possible in part by the significant negative output gap still remaining in 1941, along with the growth in potential output, whose full extent was probably first appreciated by Simon Kuznets, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, the author of the National Income and Product Accounting System, when, in planning for the war at the War Production Force, he was tasked with basically trying to figure out what the overall envelope was in terms of civilian and military production, how large the potential was. Now, in 1948, the United States did indeed stand astride the world like an economic colossus. But it's basically, in my view, almost an optical illusion to attribute this to learning during the war. The large productivity advantage enjoyed in manufacturing is already evident. It was not due to experience gained during the war. It's already evident in 1939 or 1941. And what it did, it reflected learning during the prior two decades, making cars, refrigerators, and a wide range of other goods. The productivity differential widened during the war. It's true. But this largely reflected damage to the production facilities of future competitors and trading partners, which the U.S. largely escaped. In Japan, it was not just Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but almost every other city, over 60 of them, with the possible exception of Kyoto and a couple of others, which were firebombed and had been largely devastated. Germany had experienced huge destructions in cities like Hamburg and Dresden. Britain had to basically liquidate its overseas economic empire to pay for the war. The Soviets lost 20 million people. During the 3 decades after the war, what the French call les Trente Glorieuses, the OECD countries largely closed this productivity differential. For the United States, much of the wartime knowledge was product-specific. I don't want to downplay the learning and so on. And shortly after VE or VJ Day, we ceased making most of these new goods. It might have been different if the U.S. had persisted in making 100,000 piston-driven aircraft in the next decade, but we didn't, and we won't. The image of the U.S. economy is rapidly shifting to production in the war, which is kind of the position, the sense I had going into this research. Once Pearl Harbor was attacked, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, 3 shifts and so forth, I think is misleading. In terms of inputs, the economy moved quickly from a surplus to a state of shortage, resulting in persisting production intermittency. What I'm saying there is that production stopped on a line. You had 95% of a tank completed. You couldn't get the treads, or you were making a destroyer. You couldn't get the heat exchangers and so on. And so a 95% complete tank is about militarily as useful as not having one at all. And production had to stop. And so these shortages were basically due to the inability to obtain initially immediate inputs like raw materials, subsequently sub-assemblies, I mentioned heat exchangers, and ultimately, by the time you get to 1943, labor. These shortages would have been serious in terms of their effect on overall productivity, even in the absence of other shocks, and I'll finish up that now. Although aside from damage on the island of Oahu, the ineffective shelling of oil refineries in Santa Barbara by a Japanese submarine in 1942, and 5 deaths in Oregon in 1945 due to hot air, bomb-laden hot air balloons floated over from Japan, the United States did not experience physical damage the way many of our allies did. That said, 2 other themes in the book. The Japanese imposed a very damaging rubber famine on the United States in 1942 when they overran the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore and rapidly took over all Southeast Asian sources for natural rubber, depriving the United States of 97% of the supply of the one strategic material for which we had effectively no domestic sourcing. The Germans also contributed, particularly in 1942, by shutting down the tanker pipeline, a fleet of 250 ships that brought petroleum and petroleum products from East Texas and Louisiana to the eastern seaboard, where 40% of U.S. consumption was concentrated. The resulting enemy-induced raw material shortages potentiated the initially chaotic transition to a radically different product mix. For those interested who want more details, I do encourage you to take a look at the book. Thank you very much.
This is, now I would like to remind you, this is Senator Todd Young. He represents the Hoosiers, so he's like Wendell Willkie in the U.S. Senate. He serves on the Select Committee on Intelligence, Finance, Commerce, Science and Transport, Small Business, and he's going to tell us today about Wendell, the Forgotten Rebel.
And again, I am from Indiana, so it's great to be with all of you. I have it on good authority that a participant in this panel was visiting Indiana in recent years, and they landed in Indianapolis, as most do in our state. They went to the State House in downtown Indianapolis. They were having lunch. They checked their timepiece, and then they said to a friend that was there, "I must go to Rushville." Most people don't say that when they come to Indianapolis, candidly. Now, for those who might not be familiar with Hoosier geography, Rushville is a small town. It's in east central Indiana, and it's not necessarily a common destination. We don't hear it referenced often, but we're proud of the town, of course. I think you know who that visitor may have been. She is the energy behind this conference today. Her work is, in fact, the reason so many of us have re-examined the narrative that we were force-fed in high school and college about the unqualified success of the New Deal program. She was on her way to Rushville in Indiana to pay her respects to one of the New Deal's greatest critics. And that's who I've been invited to discuss today. So I imagine, Amity, that you stood in front of Wendell Willkie's grave in East Hill Cemetery on the edge of town there in relative silence. Quite a contrast to the scene in Rushville, Indiana in the last days of the summer of 1940. Let me take you back. On a September evening, after a torchlight parade marched through Rushville's streets, small town here, led by the local high school marching band and accompanied by an elephant man named Mina. It was a different time, folks. Thousands of well-wishers gathered around a train car at the Baltimore and Ohio station to hear this Hoosier speak from the rear platform of a rail car. But the real audience for his remarks was not in Rushville, Indiana, was not in the state of Indiana. It was in the White House. Wendell Willkie spoke about Franklin D. Roosevelt's class war, his doctrine of economic sabotage. The greatest compliment Willkie could give the president was the following: he doesn't understand the law of economics, government finance, or the forces at work in the world today. That was the highest praise he had to offer. Campaigns then as now can be tough. With that, fireworks streaked in the sky, spelling out two phrases. The first, "God bless America," must have been impressive fireworks for the time. And the second, "Win with Willkie." Now, we spend a great amount of time discussing the presidency and the men who, no matter how obscure have held the highest office in the land, as we have come to call it. But we could learn a great deal from some of the men who aspired to the office but never quite made it. Chief among them, I would argue, is Wendell Willkie. And just to be clear, it's not just because he was a Hoosier, though admittedly that doesn't hurt. Willkie's train pulled out of Rushville, Indiana that September evening, destined for the Pacific Coast. He traveled thousands of miles, he delivered dozens of speeches, launching the only presidential campaign that ever gave FDR a real run for his money. Of course, Wendell Willkie was not your average Hoosier, and he was not your run-of-the-mill Republican. His parents were both lawyers. It was said that Wendell Willkie's family library in his hometown of Elwood was the best in the state, and that his father, Herman, read Shakespeare to young Wendell before bed. Still today, that's not what most Hoosier families do. Herman Willkie was a progressive supporter of William Jennings Bryan. As a student at Indiana University, Wendell was a leftist himself. He was a delegate to the 1932 Democrat Convention, and eventually he supported FDR. So how then did this man come to run against FDR just 8 years later? Well, in part because he left Indiana, launching a successful corporate career, first as a lawyer at Firestone in Akron, Ohio, where it should be noted he fought to keep the KKK off of the city's school board. And then in Manhattan, first as counsel, then as president of the utilities holding company Commonwealth and Southern. By the end of the 1920s, utilities had electrified cities. They had replaced kerosene lamps with electric lights. As Amity alluded to earlier, these were very important, very impressive businesses of the day. In fact, Amity has rightly called them miracle industry. So as the decade ended and the stock market crashed, the Great Depression came, and in 1933, FDR arrived in the White House. An era of bold, persistent experimentation began. The primary subject of this experimentation was business. And as you might expect, where there is government experimentation, there is often great uncertainty and inefficiency that follows. New Dealers especially singled out one business for torture as they experimented, and that was utilities. The Justice Department pursued utility leaders in court. Congress passed legislation to divide up their companies, and the government competed with utilities directly. They established the Tennessee Valley Authority, still around today, and the Rural Electric Administration. Willkie thought he could work with government. He gave a shot at that. His negotiations, so to speak, with David Lilienthal, one of the TVA heads, disabused him of this idea. So did clashes with Roosevelt himself in the White House. In fact, the president, during one meeting, said, "Mr. Willkie, I am one of your customers," to which Mr. Willkie responded, "We give you good service, don't we?" As time passed, the New Deal experimentation grew more radical, and Roosevelt doubled down on his assault of American businesses. In many instances, the Supreme Court sided with the experimenters. So Willkie's Commonwealth and Southern eventually surrendered and sold part of itself to TVA. But Willkie, now a Republican, wasn't silenced. He spoke publicly in America's Town meeting of the Air Radio show where he called the New Deal a bedtime story. He had previously claimed the TVA waters 5 states and drains the nation. I'm going to memorize that line. No other foe of the New Deal had spoken so powerfully on behalf of economic freedom or warned so clearly against the dangers of reckless government intervention. Free enterprise would revive America's fortunes, not central planning, Willkie believed. He made those arguments. He thought the first, that is, free enterprise, brought prosperity, but the second, central planning, was government above the people, without the people, and despite the people. As he shared this message, Wilkie gained traction. His dark horse candidacy at the 1940 Republican Convention succeeded and made him the new GOP leader. And though he lost to Roosevelt in 1940, which we all know, he won more votes than any other Republican before him, even Herbert Hoover. His message of opportunity, individualism, his argument against class warfare in favor of what we will call classical liberalism did not carry the day, but it won over millions of Americans. And it brought back debate to the center of American life. Even more than that, during the campaign, Wilkie had agreed at Roosevelt's request not to make a political issue out of the president's controversial plan to send destroyers to the United Kingdom. After the election, Wilkie supported Lend-Lease, another Roosevelt program that provided much-needed aid to Winston Churchill and cash-strapped Britain and its desperate fight against Nazi Germany. Wilkie's statesmanship afforded Roosevelt the opportunity to fortify America's allies, to build its arsenal of democracy, and eventually save Western civilization. And he did that at a political cost, angering parts of his own party. When he sought the Republican presidential nomination again in 1944, Wilkie was and also ran. These are important and lasting legacies. I am coming back to Rushville, and I think I will come back as President of the United States. So Wilkie predicted that September evening back in 1940 as he departed the great state of Indiana. As we know, this did not come to pass, but something else Wendell Wilkie said on the back of that train did. Wilkie said, "It has come to the lot of a boy born in Indiana to carry the burden which may result in changing the course of the history of mankind." And in his unique way, this Hoosier boy, Wendell Wilkie, altered the future, and we should be forever grateful that he did. So I hope that you too will someday find your way to Rushville, Indiana, and pay tribute to this transformative Hoosier. Thank you.
Thank you. And you know, FDR said around that time, "I'm tired." Maybe not so much more New Deal. And part of that was pressure from Wilkie and Wilkie's political and message success. People change their minds. People can be shifted. Now we are turning to a brilliant elucidator, I will say, Arthur Herman. He's the author of many books. If you ever go to Scotland, please take his book about Scotland, How the Scots Invented the Modern World. Wonderful book about Gandhi and Churchill. I just can't say enough about Arthur. I think he's one of our premier historians. What he's going to focus on today is his work in a book called Freedom's Forge, How American Business Produced Victory in World War II. And Arthur, if you disagree with Dr. Field, that's okay. We like to have many points of view, so that will be fun. Arthur, welcome.
Thank you very much. Are you hearing me okay? Good. Thank you, Amity. That's very high praise coming from another premier historian, American history. I'm here to talk to you about the role of American business in World War II. And I think a good way to get started on this would be to do a thought exercise. Imagine you are President of the United States, and you have been, over the course of the last few weeks, learning about the world's most aggressive totalitarian power has unleashed a new form of warfare, one involving mass mechanized armor, supported by tactical air power. And it is sweeping all of Europe in front of it. First over Poland, which was a serious military power in 1939, and is now sweeping across and devastating France and forcing Great Britain's back to the wall. And you know that this type of warfare, that your army has absolutely nothing that's going to be able to compare or deal with this thing. You have, in the case of the United States as president, the United States has the 19th largest army in the world. Hungary has a bigger army than you do. Brazil has a bigger army than you do. Now, you have a pretty good Navy. Navy's in very good shape, thanks to the building program that you, as president, unleashed in the 1930s for battleships and aircraft carriers. But if Britain falls to this totalitarian power, to Nazi Germany, and Britain comes to control, Germany and Hitler comes to control that British fleet, the largest in the world, then you are going to have a Nazi sea power and a military power that can arrive right at the shores of the Atlantic. And in fact, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General George Marshall, has told you that if Hitler lands 5 divisions on the eastern coast, there is nothing the U.S. Army can do to stop him. He can roll right through the middle of the country with no obstacles, no way in which powerless to stop that from happening. That's the situation you're facing. So what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, what you do is you pick up the phone and you call, at the advice of a major Democrat fundraiser by the name of Bernard Baruch, who had headed the war mobilization program in World War I and who had told you that this is a lot more complicated. I don't know how you would get started with this one. And he has advised you to call the chairman of General Motors, William Knudsen, and turn the program over to him. What do? How do we get the United States from basically a standing start as a military power to be ready to confront a threat that Nazi Germany and fascist Italy and possibly Imperial Japan posed to us? And what, as I explained in Freedom's Forge, what Bill Knudsen does is say to Roosevelt, in effect, if you give me and my colleagues in American industry, if you give us 18 months, we can retool and refit America's factories and production facilities and shipyards, and by the time we are finished, you're going to have more war material coming out that you'll know what to do with. The experts are calling you crazy because you'd like to see the United States be able to launch 50,000 combat planes. We're going to give you 3 or 4 times more. Give us that 18 months window, and we'll be able to convert over. Now, as it happens, Roosevelt consented, and basically, against his best New Deal instincts, decided to hand the problem over to American business, to Bill Knudsen and his colleagues, and to give them the lead in taking care of and dealing with this mass production miracle that would be turned loose on the country and then on the world. And of course, it worked. And in fact, by chance, Bill Knudsen and his colleagues had that 18-month window, because their program got started in June of 1940, and by the time bombs drop on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, U.S. military production has already begun to approach that of Nazi Germany, which had had an entire, almost a decade of preparation for that kind of mobilization. And you know, the numbers still stagger when you look at them. 350,000 combat planes, 7 times what experts had told Roosevelt was impossible. By 1944, we're producing a warplane every 5 minutes, right? We're talking about 181 submarines. We're talking about over 800 naval craft, destroyers, cruisers, as well as battleships and aircraft carriers. By 1944, we're producing 8 aircraft carriers a month. We're talking about 86,000 tanks. We're talking about 250,000 trucks, 500,000 Jeeps, 2.5 million artillery paces, 2.5 million machine guns, and 41 billion, with a B, rounds of ammunition. That's the miracle. That's what Knudsen and his colleagues did. And what I want to do is to give you, and everybody's today is wondering how did they do it? How is this possible to achieve this kind of unleashing of America's productivity and America's industrial might in this kind of way that would astonish the world and guarantee victory in World War II? Well, I've got time to focus on three basic principles for you to think about. The first one is that Knudsen went and sought out the most productive companies. And that's why I think this argument actually complements Alex Field's instead of contradicting it. That was to tap into that productivity of the American industry and economy as it existed in 1940 and 1941 and turn it loose on products that it never made before. Because Knudsen knew if you turn to the most productive, the biggest companies with the most engineers, that they'd figure out how to make this stuff. That you could ask the engineers, for example, at General Electric, and to show them a diagram of something called a bazooka, an anti-tank weapon, and say, can you make this? And can you make 10,000 of these in 30 days? And they'd figure out how to do it. Then you could turn to a company like Saginaw Steering Gear that made components not just for General Motors, but across the automobile industry. And if you ask them to make 2,600 30 caliber machine guns based on a Browning design, that they would produce 28,000 instead. That if you turn to Chrysler and ask them to make tanks, they had never seen a tank before, but they would figure out how to do it and mass produce it by the tens of thousands. That if you asked Ford Motor Company to not just make parts for aircraft engines, but also to produce entire bombers, a complex bomber like the B-24, that the Ford Motor Company would figure out how to do it and how to bring this kind of process about. So that was number one. Seek out the most productive, with the most engineers, the most innovative company, and they'll figure out how to do what needs to be done. Number two, and that is that you focus on results, not process. And Knudsen explained that the whole acquisition system that the United States had developed since World War I, interwar years, all had to be thrown out. No one wanted to do business with the federal government. It was too complicated. The regulations were strict. It was too costly because you had to pay for your own prototypes for a government weapon system that was being asked for. When they wanted the general purpose vehicle known as the Jeep, the Army sent out 186 requests for proposals in the summer of 1940. Only 2 companies answered. None of the major automobile companies wanted any part of it because they didn't want to work with the federal government. Knudsen said, you got to change that. That's got to be completely shifted and changed over. And you've got to be able to say, when they say it's going to be too expensive to refit this factory, too expensive to build this prototype, you say, we'll pay for it. The federal government will pay for it. It's the origin of the cost plus contract, which became the mainstay for the buildup, both in World War II and then in the Cold War as well. The third component is to keep it voluntary. At no time during the war did the United States government say to a company, you have to make this instead of that. They never said to workers, you can't work in that factory, you have to move to work in this shipyard or to that facility here. It was all kept voluntary all the way through. Because Knudsen knew that if there was a government contract there that was not going to be, saddled with regulations and all these additional costs, that companies would rise up to find what it is they could produce the best, even if they hadn't made it before. Take the example of the M1 carbine. M1 carbine, that companies like National Postage Meter, Remington Typewriter stepped up and decided we could make this, we could convert over to produce things, and so they did. The best example of that being probably the company Rock-Ola. Rock-Ola, the company that made jukeboxes in the Chicago area. The CEO of Rock-Ola saw the ad looking for people who were willing to build M1 carbines. He said, we could do that, and so they did. And after the war, Rock-Ola, from the working on the mass production that they had done with the jukeboxes, moved from becoming a regional player in the jukebox industry to a national player. And in fact, it was the jukeboxes that they now had in cafes and restaurants and bars all across the country with the new music that was being played in the 1950s, which is why that music becomes known as rock and roll. It's a corruption of Rockola. Did you know that? You see, this is why you need to come to more of these Coolidge events, because you will learn important data of this kind here as well. The point is that Knudsen understood what it was going to take to make American business come alive, to make it productive, to bringing into the mainstream of making America a safer and more secure country. And I think one of the points about Freedom's Forge and about that book is that it keeps us optimistic that what we had done once in terms of being able to prepare for dealing with totalitarian enemies and to make our country more safe and secure and to use the incentives and drive of American business, the private sector to do it, we can do again. I'm done. Thank you.
Our final speaker is going to talk about the very kind of coercion that didn't occur in the buildup to the armament for World War II. Post-war, I remind you that we are proud that Garland is a trustee of the Coolidge Foundation, a historian and a business hero himself. We recently republished, we like it so much, with editor Jed Donahue, who's somewhere in this room, a book. There's Jed. Please approach him if you have an article idea. A stunning book Garland wrote called 1924 about that campaign between Davis and Coolidge. It's a year of two conservatives, as Garland points out. And in Coolidge House currently, we have an exhibit of photos of the also ran Davis, to Senator Young's point, that the also ran is very important and sometimes changes the culture more than we know. Today, Garland will speak about an effort to coerce this company, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, from the Truman administration. Welcome, Garland.
Thank you. Can you all hear this okay? Okay, good. I'm going to digress just a minute on two things. I want to thank Professor Bruner for telling the story of the crisis of 1907, which I think is one of the most interesting stories around. And I want to just mention one little footnote to that story that he didn't mention, but I think is interesting and maybe a little bit instructive, I don't know. But when the titans of finance met in Morgan's library to try to figure out what to do with the crisis, and they came up with the plan, it was late Saturday afternoon, and it dawned on them that they had missed the deadline for the Sunday papers, and they were concerned that if they didn't get the word out that the crisis was going to build and just really blow up on Monday. So someone suggested, I don't know whether it was Morgan or someone else suggested, well, the best way to get this in front of the public in New York is for Morgan to write a letter and we'll distribute it to all the churches in New York because most everybody will be in church tomorrow. Well, that's I guess that's what happened back in the days before the internet and cell phones and all. And sadly, I think today, if we relied on that, we probably wouldn't get too much of the American public, but it gives you a snapshot of what the public was doing on Sunday mornings back then. The second thing, I want to thank Arthur Herman for not only his comments today, but his book, and really urge you to read Freedom's Forge. And it was mentioned earlier today in one of the talks that, one of the interpretations or themes of history is the importance of individuals and how it boils down to, in some circumstances, boils down to what individuals do. And I think you really got I know in reading his book, I got the distinct picture of President Roosevelt sitting there with this decision, and he has Henry Wallace and his wife whispering in his ear that this is the golden opportunity for the government to take over, to do everything we've dreamed of doing in the New Deal and take over business. And then he had Bernard Baruch and some other people whispering in the other ear. And, it could have gone either way. Unfortunately, it went the way it did. So thank you. And I really encourage you to read that book. It's an exciting story. Okay, on to my task here. I've got the distinct privilege of introducing you to a small chapter in American history that you probably never heard of, and an individual that you almost certainly know nothing about. So if you haven't dozed off already, I'll try to keep you awake and, and bring this story alive, because I think it really does have some relevance. And in case you maybe are one of those people who think that, well, history doesn't have too much relevance, it's, I think, significant that we're talking about this case, this Youngstown Steel case today, and John Davis, today, because there are rumors around that the Supreme Court is going to render its decision on the Trump tariff case today. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but this.
Not going to happen.
Not going to happen today. Okay. All right. Well, the rumor was false, but it's coming any day now, they say. So there's some real parallels to Youngstown Steel and the Trump tariff case. The man involved in this was, as Amity's already mentioned, was John Davis, who was a legendary lawyer, was a former Democratic presidential nominee, and as hopefully all you students know from reading Coolidge's autobiography, he was the man that Coolidge defeated decisively in 1924. Davis was a Democrat. He was from the Jeffersonian wing of the Democratic Party, and really agreed on almost every issue with Calvin Coolidge. There was very little for them to debate in 1924. And Davis had been warning, he even warned the country under Hoover that the country was moving towards more government intrusion, and then he really became concerned in 1932. He wrote the Democratic platform, which was a party platform, which was a very conservative platform, and then became alarmed shortly after Roosevelt came into office, became alarmed at how quickly Roosevelt abandoned the platform and moved in an opposite direction. It was soon clear to Davis and other conservatives in the Democratic Party that FDR was going far beyond anything that Hoover had imagined. And Davis became very active in opposing FDR and the New Deal in public speeches, in forming the Liberty League, and most importantly, in challenging the New Deal legislation in the courts. He became quite an advocate. He was a brilliant lawyer, and it wasn't long before, predictably, FDR had branded Davis as, quote, public enemy number one, his fellow Democrat, and that was a sobriquet that Davis wore with some pride over the years. While the New Deal ended with World War II, arguably ended with World War II and the death of Roosevelt, the battle against expansion continued under President Harry Truman, Roosevelt's successor. And I think one of the great chapters in American constitutional history is the 1952 Supreme Court case, Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. And this case is frequently taught in U.S. law schools and often cited in modern court cases. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the current Trump case, the tariff case, is coming up, and undoubtedly, whichever way the court decides there's going to be some mention of Youngstown Steel in that, because it has to do with the limits on executive power. While it's always difficult to predict how the court's going to go, I think it's instructive to look at precedents, and one of the key precedents is Youngstown Steel. So here, very briefly, is the story of Youngstown Steel. In 1951, in the midst of the Korean War, Truman faced a real problem. Collective bargaining between the nation's steel companies and their unions had reached a stalemate, and the management was unwilling to yield to the unions, and the unions were convinced that their demands were reasonable. And Truman was committed to ensuring that the war effort had what it needed, and he wanted to maintain price stability. So he was faced with the dilemma how to deal with this strike, or the potential for this strike. The most available remedy for Truman was to invoke the Taft-Hartley Act. There was a remedy that he could have turned to, but As a partisan Democrat, Truman hated the Taft-Hartley Act, which had been sponsored by Republicans, and he refused to invoke it. And after much posturing on both sides, it was a front-page issue, Truman announced very suddenly that he was directing Commerce Secretary Sawyer to seize the steel, to take control of the steel mills. I think there were 8 major steel companies. As he pondered this unprecedented action, I think this is interesting, Truman received unofficial and very inappropriate assurance from his old friend, Supreme Court Chief Justice Fred Vinson. Vinson believed that such a move by Truman would be upheld by the court, and in fact, the clear majority of the court at this time was now filled with liberal-leaning justices who were generally sympathetic to Truman. But when Truman announced this, the reaction in Congress was immediate, and within days there were 14 separate resolutions to impeach Truman. Lawmakers warned that against a trend towards dictatorship, and one senator, Pat McCarran, warned, quote, "We have lost the democracy that we have long loved." Does it sound kind of familiar to some of the rhetoric that we get these days or have seen in these days? Well, up to this point, the steel companies had sought separate legal counsel, but they decided to consolidate their case and very wisely turned to John Davis. And I'll mention, this is a plug for the book we heard about last night, full-time David Bonson's book about not retiring or continuing your productive work. Well, John Davis was 79 years old when the steel companies turned to him. He was still the senior partner of Davis, Polk, and Wardwell. Had argued at that time 138 cases before the Supreme Court, more than any other modern American. And it was really quite an honor to turn to someone at that age and say, we want you to make the sole representation at the court. Well, that's what Davis wound up doing. And on May 12th, 1952, Davis delivered an 87-minute argument before a packed court. Speaking with heartfelt conviction, he declared Truman's action not only an usurpation of power without parallel in American history, but a reassertion of the kingly prerogative, the struggle which illumines all the pages of Anglo-Saxon history. As one news reporter wrote, Davis seemed to personify the spirit of constitutionalism, his voice of history itself. In somber conclusion, Davis paused for effect and then quietly quoted Thomas Jefferson with these words, "In questions of power, let no more be said of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution." Very famous words, and Davis concluded. The Washington Post reported at the conclusion of Davis's argument that seldom has a court sat in such silent admiration. And because of the urgency of this case, the court rendered its ruling in less than 30 days, quite remarkable. And Chief Justice Vinson's advice to President Truman proved to have been ill-founded. The court ruled 6-3 against Truman and his unprecedented seizure of private property. This landmark ruling supported two key pillars of American conservatism: the sanctity of private property and the constitutional restraint on executive powers. This case enforced the bedrock principle that all Americans, and especially presidents, must abide by the Constitution. For American conservatives, John W. Davis stands tall in our panoply of heroes, and the Youngstown case was his finest hour. As the current Supreme Court has wrestled with the Trump tariff case, it has no doubt weighed seriously the precedent of Youngstown Steel and the arguments of John W. Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Young, Dr. Herman, Mr. Tucker, and Dr. Field. We're going to go straight to the students because of time, and we'd like your questions. I'll take how about the young man with the blue shirt?
State your name and brief. My name is Charlie Miller. I'm from North Carolina, and I'm a freshman at the College of William and Mary. I have a question for Senator Young. Do you think that Wendell Willkie's kind of mixed political background, having switched from one party to another, affected his campaign? And if so, was it a challenge or was it perhaps a benefit?
Well, thank you. To be candid, I don't know because I didn't have a relationship with him. But as you asked the question, what do I think? I think that oftentimes some of our most sophisticated and successful political actors are those who have changed their mind on some fundamental questions over the years because it gives them a certain deal of empathy with respect to others who harbor opposing views. And it allows them and empowers them and fortifies them to make arguments that are appealing to people who harbor the views they once had. And so this is one reason why, as I see young adults across the room, why I think it's incredibly healthy to marinate yourself, in conversations like this. If you're of a conservative bent, as I suspect so many of you would describe yourselves, but also to place yourself in unfamiliar environments where unfamiliar arguments are made, so that you're prepared to counter those or even challenge your own views. So I do think it no doubt shaped his views. He doesn't strike me, as I read about Wendell Willkie, as I read the things he said, this is not an ideologue, right? This is someone who has really considered his views. This is not someone who's just read talking points in his public life. He brought genuine life experiences to bear and drew on those to inform his opinions. And clearly he was comfortable as someone who started off a William Jennings Bryan supporter as a young person and evolved into probably what today we would characterize as sort of a center-right Republican. I think that no doubt played an important role in his success.
How many here describe themselves as Midwestern? Can you raise your hand? Thank you, Senator Young, for coming. Now there's a young gentleman over there who has a question.
My name is Leo Guan. I'm a senator from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm a third year at Georgia Tech. And so I have a question for both Dr. Herman and Senator Young, which is, what do you think about how we're handling imminent threats to national security, such as quantum computing? And I guess mirroring what we did in the Second World War, what role do you think the private sector should play in that?
Yeah, there we are. We're back. That's an interesting question. I'm glad you bring up quantum computing because one of the topics that I've been working on from a policy angle over the last 5 years is in quantum technology. And without bragging about it, I, in fact, put together a consortium of labs and companies that put together global standards for quantum key distribution and quantum random numbers generators, which we took to Geneva, actually, to the International Telecommunications Union, and got their approval. Even the Chinese and the Russians said, yeah, these are really good standards, we're going to work with them. So it's a topic that's been very much on my mind, you understand. But I think I think quantum's era is coming, but I think the key battleground right now in terms of high tech is obviously AI and machine learning. And what I think you're going to see is that we are in a comfortable position in the sense that we have a AI industry which has become more and more aware of the national security implications of what they do and what they're involved with. And I think that what we have is, we have to understand, World War II, in the case of World War II, there was no defense industry, right? It had basically been killed off by isolationist and anti-war sentiment in the interwar years. And it basically had to be stood up from scratch. We don't have that situation today. We have a large and very competent defense industry. It needs fixing. It needs additional focus, particularly in the high-tech areas. And I think my own feeling is that there's more and more of awareness in Congress, in the Pentagon, and industry as a whole, that more and more of the innovation that's going to be required and the productivity that's going to be required with high tech, whether you're talking AI or you're talking about quantum or hypersonics, another area I spent a good deal of time with on the policy side, that in all of these, getting the drive, the vision, the energy that the private sector brings to bear here becomes the key. And I think that's one of the key lessons, if I may, for Freedom's Forge, is that it's through the private sector that you get the best results in terms of developing a industrial base, a manufacturing base, but also a defense industrial base. It's not the only way. China, Nazi Germany before them have tried and used alternate ways in which to bring about and create impressive defense industrial bases and to arm and equip their military. But today, as in 1940, it's the private sector that needs to be unleashed. It's the private sector, I believe, that holds the keys to victory.
Well, I'm in agreement, and thank you for the question. It's such an interesting question because many of the applications for quantum that are imagined are just fairly abstract and not very well articulated these days. But we know quantum can be used for one thing, and that's to break our codes. And that has very direct national security implications, which makes this a really interesting question because the private sector will not on its own solve that problem unless given the economic incentive by government. And so there are instances where government needs to be thoughtful and where government leaders need to discern what is necessary for our national security. There are dicier areas, from my perspective, areas I'm very skeptical of, but nonetheless, there are thoughtful arguments made about other applications of quantum technology and the need for Americans to get ahead of the curve. An example might be pharmaceuticals. So we can come up with new life-saving and life-improving compounds through the wonder of quantum computing. But I think most of the investments needed in people, so we have quantum experts out there and incentives for people to major in quantum science, or infrastructure investments in quantum required to come up with the next great drug compound will indeed be made by private companies and private investors because a major profit is there for the taking. And I think government can also play a role. We don't talk often, I think frequently enough, about the incentive created through our tax code to engage in research and development in the next business process or the next technology. We Republicans just passed a large tax bill as part of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And within that larger bill were certain incentives for businesses to invest in research and development. Why do we do that? With the understanding that there are often meaningful spillover benefits beyond the company itself, beyond the investors in that company itself. And so that's how I think about government role, but we need to be very careful if government starts to assume responsibilities for incentivizing technologies that aren't really proven, right?
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Tiana Law, and I suppose my question would be directed more towards Mr. Herman, but anyone can answer. I guess I'm worried about globalization in this process. Would America still be able to mobilize so quickly in terms of in times of crisis today if we rely so much now on global supply chains?
Good, great question.
That is a wonderful question.
Can I ask Dr. Field to answer it too, though?
Of
Doctor,
course, no.
Does globalization, you too?
That, of course, is probably the main one of the main differences between where we were in 1940 versus where we are today. In 1940, the supply chain was pretty much what we needed here in the 48 states. If you needed some materials, it was here. with some exceptions, and some very rare minerals like tungsten, for example, which had to be imported from Latin America. But apart from that, that was the case. As you point out, today we have global supply chain that's important and essential, including for many of our leading weapons systems, as we found out to our cost with the numbers that up until very recently were reliant on suppliers from China, in some cases sole suppliers. I can give you some specific examples, but I think it's widely known now that this was a vulnerability we hadn't really thought about for 2 decades, but now I think we're very much focused on that and what that is involved with. And that's why I think in many ways one of the most important initiatives underway right now in terms of national security is the push towards reindustrialization. And one of the things that I find so gratifying about my book, Freedom's Forge, has been it's not only helped to inspire big debate about how do we revive our defense industrial base, including taking on the problems that you've just mentioned of supply chain, but it also has had spilled over to companies that are thinking about manufacturing in the civilian sector as well. You know, I was in Detroit for the Reindustrialized Summit this summer, and spoke there on the book and had a book signing there in a long line of people lined up. And these are not people involved in the defense industry. They're making like motorcycles, you know, and all kinds of, and a whole range of consumer goods. And they're all lining up to have me sign copies of the Freedom's Forge. And one of them came up to me and said, "Do you realize that you are the spiritual godfather of the entire reindustrialized movement?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that, but if it's a title you want to give me, I'm willing to take it on." Because it's precisely the issue you've touched on. You can't have a powerful military if you don't have a strong defense industrial base. Key lesson of the book. You can't have a good defense industrial base if you don't have a strong, larger industrial base. And that includes having a supply chain that's reliable, resilient, and that you can count on in terms of crisis.
Yeah, thank you.
Amen.
Thank you. Yeah, I just would say I think there are some more parallels between the situation of the Second World War than Mr. Herman was suggesting. I think countries, the United States today, all countries face this dilemma between relying on cheap, reliable imports of a critical or strategic material, just-in-time inventory management. Works fine until it doesn't. And we had the same situation with rubber, which has been largely overlooked. Actually, the longest chapter in my book. Rubber was the largest commodity import by value in the interwar period in the United States. The United States had no domestic supplies of it. It was much more serious than people have appreciated. The Rubber Survey Committee in 1942, chaired by Bernard Baruch, and including Carl Compton, head of MIT, and James Conan, head of Harvard, basically said, if we don't solve this problem quickly, the war will be over. Frederick Eberstadt said the same thing, and so on. So I'm just simply saying I don't have the solution, but you have to make a trade-off between whether you're willing to pay for stockpiling, standby production capability, which is going to be more expensive than cheap foreign imports, and it's like buying insurance. And so an insurance seems a waste. You know, if you pay the premium and nothing happens, it seems like a good idea if that's not the case.
And you have to have the foresight to see the problem before it's upon you.
Just in case, not only just in time, is need a little of that.
Well, please join me in thanking this splendid panel.